Dr. Silverman, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate you being here. Hi, how are you?
You can't call me Dr. Silverman.
Okay, Linda.
I'm fine, Marlo. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So, this topic is one that, as I think most of you know, is pretty near and dear to my heart. I've specialized in gifted and twice exceptional kids and kind of had a special niche for autism for about 30 years. And so, this is a fun topic for me, but I think it's also a challenging one because I know in the world of gifted education, we didn't really include individuals with autism until we started really talking about twice exceptionality. So, it was almost like these two worlds have been kind of separated. I know, Linda, for you, they have not been, but I would say in the general population, we've kind of assumed that people with autism have, it's almost assumed they have intellectual disabilities, so they therefore can't be gifted. And within the gifted world, it's assumed that, gifted means that you're high and able and super performer to some people. And that's not necessarily true either. So, Linda, start for us, if you would, by giving us your definition of giftedness. I think that's a good place to start.
Well, my original definition would probably have left autistic kids out
Hmm.
because I very simply define them early on as those who are developmentally advanced. And since autistic kids not aren't necessarily developmentally advanced early on, we would have lost any ability to recognize those kids. But a group of us came up with a different definition of giftedness as asynchronous development. And that absolutely makes room for autistic gifted individuals to be gifted. Uh, the asynchrony has to do with very high intellectual abilities, abstract reasoning, intensity. We see that in autistic individuals anyway. And the chronological age for more neurotypical gifted kids, if they are, let's say, 5 years old, but they're mentally doing things that an 8-year-old could do, that is one type of asynchrony. But twice exceptional children have dramatic asynchronies between their ability to think and their ability to perhaps do social skills or even activities of daily life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because, for the course in the literature, we've had the number that about 75% of individuals on the autism spectrum score into the intellectually disabled range on IQ tests. And that was especially true until we started looking at kind of the newer versions of the Wechsler, and we were looking at some of the perceptual and three-dimensional problem solving skills. But it's interesting if we go back all the way to Leo Kanner and read the case studies really showed, and he would, we were calling it under that savant ability. So maybe distinguish for us how you see the difference between giftedness and savant, because I think those are kind of different.
Okay. Well, where I got the best information about intellectual disability and how how it was connected to autism, and then that changed over time was in your book, which
Thank
I
you.
love, Autism is the Future. And you talked in that book about how so many individuals who tested in the disabled range, intellectually disabled range as children, by the time they were adults, they were getting PhDs. They were doing original research. And some of them were actually getting IQ tests where they were showing that they were gifted.
Hmm.
So, your book, more than any other source that I've ever used, I quote that often to parents that um, even if your child were to start out rocking, no speech, and examining dust particles, I've seen children who started out that way who over time evolved in their language abilities, even in their social abilities. And became amazingly gifted, exceptionally gifted in some cases.
Yeah, and I've seen that too. In fact, we have a young man on our advisory board that is there for the purpose of representing the non-vocal population and didn't start speaking really at all until he was about 11 years old. Still has a spoken vocabulary of about 100 words, but took the Wechsler intelligence scale with a communication device with a letter board that he could type the answers, and it took him hours and hours and hours to get him through, and came up with a verbal IQ of 151. And that didn't surprise me because in my interactions with this kid, there was a lot more going on than he could verbally articulate. So I think that's what you're talking about too, is that there may be this latent intelligence. And by the way, when we think about the definition of intelligence, it really is we're trying to tap that innate reasoning ability, not so much how well you produce or perform or deliver on that, right? Is that your definition also?
Yes, I make a clear distinction between achievement and giftedness.
Hmm.
And that is fuzzy in the field
Hmm.
because we've defined giftedness in adults as recognized achievement. And so those people who are really into that, and there are a lot of them in academia, are unable to get beyond their own preconceptions to imagine that a person can be equally gifted without being an achiever.
Right, right. And that's
Um,
where we get into twice exceptionality.
right. So I do think it's important when you talked about this gentleman who took hours and hours to take an IQ test, that we have to recognize that IQ tests were developed primarily for school psychologists to administer in an hour and a half in a school setting.
Right.
You cannot you cannot assess an autistic gifted kid in an hour and a half in a school setting. That's not going to happen. If you're
Right.
going to give a very verbal test and you're going to give it under high pressure time constraints, you will never find out how bright this person is. This brilliant child that I had the opportunity to work with, it took 3 days to administer an hour and a half test.
Right. So let's talk about the reasons for that. Why do individuals with autism have a harder time than other people performing on an IQ test? And I have some too, but share some of the things you see that makes it so their IQ scores are far below their actual potential.
Some individuals on the spectrum that I've met are not as articulate and able to define words, and their spatial abilities or their photographic memories or their ability to point out things or attention to detail can be phenomenal. But that's not true of the entire um, group of people on the spectrum.
Right.
My grandson lives with me, he's on the spectrum. His vocabulary came out in the gifted range, but his visual abilities were in the toilet. So he did very poorly on an IQ test when he was a kid because his visual spatial abilities were not that good.
Hmm.
And yet, when I put the visual spatial learner construct on my website, it was mostly individuals on the spectrum who said, "Oh, yeah, that's me,"
That's
and
me.
gave me
Yeah.
tons and tons of anecdotes that I put in interspersed in Upside Down Brilliance.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure you would agree. Some of the things I see, the sensory system, just the tiniest
Yeah.
little noise down the hall. Like we have in my office, there's a bathroom that's like two doors down. And if somebody comes in that bathroom and flushes the toilet, that might be enough to just actually kind of tip that kid off so that they stop responding and stop performing, especially on a time test that plays out. It's interesting. I see another pattern. Um, Even on like the digit span. So where they're 86752, what did I say? Well, you said 86752. But now I have to take like 2.5 minutes to clear 86752 out of my mind before I can do the next sequence. So in other words, the old sequence is now if they didn't have that time between, then the old sequence was carrying over to the new sequence, and they were trying to merge those two sequences. That's another example. Certainly the production, the motor, even the blocks, some of these kids, the motoric aspect of even manipulating the blocks or producing with the pencil is hard because they really, you see them, that the 18-year-old who's still holding the pencil like this. So we see that the both the articulation, the using of the mouth and the using of the hands is harder in general. And then I would agree with you. Sometimes we see that they just can't communicate. Like they know this word, they know everything that relates to this word, but give me a definition. I can't define the word. An example, well, it's a cow. Kid can't tell you a cow, but he can name every farm animal, right? So obviously he knows what a cow is. He knows it's a
He can
farm
tell you
animal.
what a cow says.
Tell you what a cow says, tell you what it feels like, tell you what it smells like, tell you the texture and color of the fur, tell you all the things you can do with its fur. We can't tell you that it's a farm animal that produces milk, for example. So I'm sure you see that too. And I think that's why we see that difference in the aging process. In other words, as individuals on the spectrum mature, they're more able to handle those standards that we use in standardized tests. Are you seeing that also? Is that what you see? Or what, or do you think there's other reasons they outgrow their low number?
I'm not sure that this is true of the entire autistic spectrum, because the only ones I get to see are gifted,
Right, exactly.
and the giftedness kicks in.
Right,
And as the child matures, they are able to use more and more abstract reasoning and their pattern recognition and their ability to observe and notice things to be able to create compensation mechanisms for themselves.
right,
Now, that
right.
may not be true of the kids at the lower end of the intellectual spectrum. Maybe they don't have enough of the compensation mechanisms to be able to change their IQ over time. But with
Well,
the population, I definitely see greater reflection. And we still see meltdowns, even in teenagers. Um, we see sensory issues, even in 18-year-olds. We see a great deal of ADHD in the children who are on the and youth that are on the spectrum. So I see high degree of sensory issues, like you described,
mhm,
a great deal of ADHD. Many of these kids had either some form of birth trauma or um, the cord wrapped around their neck several times. Something about their birthing was unusual. Um, and you had asked me earlier what the difference is between savant and giftedness. So, technically, giftedness is abstract reasoning ability. And savantism is supposed to be a splinter skill where you're fabulous at chess, you're fabulous at art, you're fabulous at music. You can do things that nobody else can do. Your photographic memory is off the charts, but abstract reasoning isn't available to you. Now, I'm not, that's the what I've
wow,
been told.
yeah.
Sure that that's 100% correct, because the way in which we've always defined abstract reasoning was verbally.
Mhm, mhm,
You could see an individual who can do some pretty high level abstraction if they don't have to use words. If they're seeing the relationships among things, and they do this in their adult life,
mhm,
they are thinking abstractly, not concretely,
right,
but they're not verbal. They're not doing it verbally. And I
right.
think that's why we made that distinction between savantism and giftedness.
It's interesting because, even Kenner, one of his cases was the kid who had memorized he'd go through a map and match every single person that lived in this entire town to their actual address and where they
Wow.
lived, right? I've worked with kids. I knew a kid that didn't know names, couldn't hold on to names, but knew us by our license plate numbers, and had every single person in the entire, 50 people didn't know them, but knew their license plate number on their car. And
Mhm.
so, in other words, there's some, and you could say that that's just a savant skill that he has really good. But there's a meaningful relationship. In other words, it was harder for him to hold on to names. But everybody drives their own car. Everybody has their own license plate. Everybody has a unique number that relates to them, and that's a pretty high level skill. This kid was like 5 years old, right? So it was a skill that most kids, they wouldn't even be able to remember, far less know that we had individual license plate numbers. So I've kind of agreed with you that the abstract reasoning, our definition for abstract reasoning, has been a little too narrow by defining it as the ability to verbally define relationships between maybe high level abstract verbal concepts. There's a lot more to abstract reasoning than just that verbal expression.
I think Temple Grandin has done a lovely job in her new book, Visual Thinking, to describe what the individual on the spectrum can do if they're given the opportunity to work with their hands,
Mhm.
to see relationships in real life, and to understand objects, their structure, their manipulation, how to fix them, how to notice when something isn't right.
Right.
She can tell when a bridge is going to collapse. And
Right.
uh, is this just rote memorization? Is this just good experience? I don't think so.
Right.
I think she's having to make a whole lot of abstract connections between this bridge, all the other bridges she's seen. When she's seen other bridges that had this kind of a crack in them, it meant this, this, and this. And
Hmm.
so she's comparing
Hmm.
a lot of visual information and making abstract meaning out of all of those pictures.
Right.
I think the savant has more pictures. The savant has almost an infinite supply of pictures.
Right. Right. So, Linda, this brings me to kind of really a specialty of yours. You've talked and published, and for those of you who don't know, Linda is really the grandmother of gifted education for sure. She's written the book. She's the world leader in speaking and training on the topic of giftedness. But I think, Linda, one of the pieces of your work that's so important to this conversation is the topic of the gifted visual spatial learner. And can you talk to us a little bit about that and what that is and how that relates to what we're talking about?
Absolutely. I invented the visual spatial learner. That was my baby. And it was because I observed kids who could do amazing visual spatial feats on the IQ tests. But some of them, not all of them, but there was a good portion of them who really struggled with digit span, who
Right, which
struggled
is
with
verbal sequencing, verbal memory. Yeah.
repeating digits,
Mhm.
couldn't really um, tell you the names of the days of the week in order. Um, and you'd read them a story and they couldn't really remember what the names of the characters were.
Mhm. Mhm.
So their their auditory sequential abilities were not anywhere near what their visual spatial abilities were.
Right.
And although you'll see the word visual spatial, if you were to do a Google search, you'd see thousands of entries of everybody studying spatial visualization, visual spatial learners, but you won't find a whole lot of entries besides mine if you look under auditory sequential. It just made sense to me that the left hemisphere, which is processing speech, is sequential. We know that. We've always known that. Speech is auditory, phonemes, phonics. Those are little sound bites. To me, auditory sequential is the opposite of visual spatial.
Right.
And auditory sequential is left hemispheric preference, visual spatial is right hemispheric preference. Highly gifted people have both. They go back and forth very quickly, and so they really don't identify with one or the other because they're doing both all the time. But a lot of twice exceptional individuals, in my experience, are extremely high on the visual spatial aspect, but they're low on the auditory sequential. And a lot of them have had central auditory processing disorder. They've needed an ear filter like you needed. And they they really were struggling in any kind of a noisy environment, and they needed to have that diminishment of noise because their sensory systems would get completely overloaded.
Mhm.
And as you pointed out so many times, way before you wrote that book, about how when your sensory system gets overloaded, your adrenal system gets overloaded, and you go into fight, flight, or freeze.
Right, right,
So you see a tremendous amount of anxiety in people who have these sensory overload.
right. By the way, lots to unpack there, but what Linda I think is sharing with us is that the visual spatial and the auditory sequential are kind of two different ways. And it's important to remember that in autism, autistic individuals spread that spectrum. So they can be extremely verbal, they can be extremely visual, they can be visual spatial learners. But what we see is that their asynchrony is greater. And I think Stephen Shore talks about that, Temple talks about that, that we have the same learning styles, a range of learning styles to everybody else, but our asynchrony is much, much bigger. So that's the first thing I wanted to kind of pick up on that. But I think the next piece is really this idea that within these learning styles that we kind of get mixed up. Like we're talking about a visual spatial learner. So we're talking about kids who don't necessarily have maybe good ability to articulate what's in their head. I see word finding challenges. They know the answer. They can tell everything about it except for the answer that's on the IQ test, right? They can articulate all this other information, but it's all, and I use the term glue a lot, like visual, like they might even be really verbally gifted, but they still have visual glue. The thoughts, the way their thoughts is glued together is in pictures. It's like they route based on these icons, and like, oh, I use the fire truck analogy. What's a fire truck? Well, it's red. It has gears and hoses and blah, blah, blah. And I've seen all these things. That's a visual spatial learner. Whereas the verbal learner is going to be puts out fires. It's a very verbal, succinct, sequential response. And I know, Linda, you understand that. So let's talk about how that plays into understanding autism, because I think it's tricky. I think this is the shade of gray we get caught up in sometimes.
Well, I'd like to just mention something else first, and
Okay.
that's um, there's a section of the IQ test that's a picture concept test.
Hmm. Oh, no. I
And
know where you're going.
I'm not fond of it,
I'm not fond of it either. I don't give it.
but uh, but those who do give it notice that if you are a categorical reasoner, a left hemispheric, auditory sequential, highly verbal person, you're going to come up with categories like a fork, a spoon, and a knife go together because they're all silverware. Whereas a visual spatial individual is much more likely to say, well, the butterfly and the newspaper are related because they both can open up.
Right. Exactly.
And that
Yeah.
isn't what the tester had in mind, that the test constructor had in mind. But I started keeping records
Yeah.
of the unusual relationships that gifted kids came up
And
with.
they're right. They're not wrong. They're just not the obvious word based relationship. And that's what I see too.
Or they could be associations, like you can put the apple in a basket and you can put the basket inside the bicycle or on the
Right.
handle of the bicycle. So an apple and a basket and a bicycle go
Go
together.
together, even though in the picture there's an apple, a banana, and an orange. Right. No,
So
I
it
would agree with you, and it's a test I
very
actually don't even give
close.
anymore because I get such crazy
Yeah,
relationships on it.
I
And that's
understand.
true both that's true for gifted, twice exceptional, and autistic kids. All three of those groups tend to do perform very differently on that test than the
Even
general
visual
population.
spatial kids,
Yeah, yeah,
they will see visual associations.
right.
They will just notice things that go together in a different way than just a category or
hmm
a use.
Right, exactly. So, and that's interesting because that is one reason even a visual spatial learner, if we're using that test, is going to drop down. It's going to say that they have poor visual categorization skills when in fact they might be the tempo grandin who has much higher than the rest of us's visual categorization skills because they're categorizing very differently or gluing very differently. So yeah, that's an
I
interesting
like that
point.
gluing. That's really
Yeah, how you glue your thoughts together. Is it either in pictures or in words?
no, the gluing is wonderful. I'm probably going to steal that from
Well, thank
you.
you. Feel free. But so let's come back around though, because I think we have, first of all, I think we have some misunderstandings. And I want to talk about one of the big ones. We have this misunderstanding that gifted, twice exceptional, autistic learners are all these really visual, these really quirky visual kids. That's one miscommunication or misunderstanding. The other one is that they're all really verbally precocious and that they're like the little professors when they could be anywhere, one, the other, both of those, and everything in between. And I'm sure that's what you see as well, don't you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wish I had my grandson's vocabulary, and
Mhm.
he truly is showing verbal precocity.
Right.
And he never did show uh, what I would call the visual spatial precocity, but he's fabulous with computers. He
Right.
was he was as 6-year old. They used to bring him into the fourth grade classes to help the teacher figure out
Right. Right.
how to fix the computer when it didn't work.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'd always use that as an example of visual spatial abilities, but really it's an ability to visualize as if you lived inside the computer.
Right. Right. And that's
But
your
I
organization, it's your sequencing, it's your
right,
memory,
right.
it's
And
spatial. Yeah.
sequence has never been his strong suit.
hmm
But what another thing that drives me crazy is that visual spatial learners need more time.
Right.
And there's a visual spatial section of the IQ
It's
test.
timed.
And so all these people who come to our office because their kids are visual spatial learners don't understand why their children get such low scores on that section of the test. And they get higher scores on the verbal because the verbal parts are untimed,
Timed. Yeah.
visual spatial are timed.
Yeah.
So it takes a longer amount of time to translate a picture so that somebody else can see your picture.
Right.
I
Right.
think for these image thinkers, for these picture thinkers, it's very important for them to be given sufficient time and not to be rushed.
Right. Exactly. And we do in our testing always look at, okay, here's your score, and here's how many points would have, we can't include that in your IQ, but we can say that your score is probably an underestimate due to your processing speed. And we also find that, by the way, the processing speed is always pretty low. And by the way,
Always.
it's not 100%. I've seen autistic kids who have really fast processing speed for those copy type tasks, but they're not, but even those kids are not fast thinking. They're not the kids who are producing on the higher spatial reasoning tasks quickly, even though they might have coding or visual scanning skills really high. So,
Most of the kids that we deal with have low processing speed.
yeah, yeah.
First 55 kids that we tested on the WISC, we sent to the test constructor
hmm
who have a comparison with match controls. And the gifted sample had like 133 on the 4 verbal subtests, and their processing speed was below the norm for the match controls, where
Yeah,
every flat for the norm that there's only like less than a 1 point discrepancy between their highest and lowest. And the gifted, it's a 30-point discrepancy, but their low point is processing speed.
And by the
So
way, and you see
really,
what I see, 60 and 70-point differences too
yeah,
between comprehension, like verbal reasoning and processing speed. They can be that far apart.
really can. So you really can't you can't use processing speed to differentiate because the whole gifted population has lower processing speed.
Right. So let's talk about I know you have created I know you use general ability index scores, which is kind of factors out for people who don't know that factors out some of the memory and some of the processing speed and gets us back to your definition of IQ, which is abstract reasoning. But you have some other ways to look at those scores. Can you talk about the extended norms that you use?
Well, yes, I can tell you about extended norms. I can also tell you about the expanded index scores because I invented one of those.
I knew that. So
I
let's talk about that.
I called it the gifted index, but the publisher wouldn't buy that. They called it instead the expanded general ability index. And it requires that the tester give 3 optional or supplementary subtests that most testers don't give. And there's a down and dirty 7 item, 7 subtest score you can get that just gives you the full scale IQ score. That's the worst thing.
Wasted on our kids.
They should never have put that together. It's not good for gifted kids at all. Uh,
Or twice exceptional or autistic kids.
no, it's. I don't believe in full scale scores, period. But the uh, there are 5 composite scores, and you have to give 2 of each. There's 5 factors, and so you have to give 2 subtests in each of those in order to come up with your core 10. And that's all that most psychologists know how to do. What they haven't bothered to do or haven't been told to do is to read the technical reports that are on Pearson's website that describe the expanded index scores, which are very good for gifted. And what's better than mine is the verbal expanded crystallized index. And that's made up of all 4 verbal subtests. That's vocabulary, similarities, information, and comprehension.
Mhm.
You only give 2 of those,
You
the
don't get
child
it.
will
Yeah.
get pretty high score, but not as high as they would if they did all 4.
Right. Right.
That's the most robust indicator of giftedness that there is on the WISC 5 is those 4. So the VECI is really an important thing for people to give. That requires giving all 4 of the verbal.
Mhm.
To do the expanded general ability index, that I call the gifted index, you have to give those 4, and you have to give 2 that I call visual spatial. They call one fluid reasoning and the other visual spatial. And that's block design and matrix reasoning.
Mhm. Which
And
one
you
is timed and one is not.
have to give 2 mathematical. So I put 2 math, 2 spatial, 4 verbal. And the 3 of those are core tests that all of the psychologists are giving anyway. But arithmetic, very, very few psychologists administer. And it's so important for our population.
It is. Yep,
They
I agree.
bomb on so many different things and be mathematically gifted, mathematically talented, need to have a quantitative reasoning index come up with. And the EGAI has arithmetic and the um, I'm
Verbal
picturing
comprehensive. Yeah. We're talking
no,
about verbal comprehensive.
I'm picturing the visual mathematical one with that has
Oh,
all
the
of the
figure weights.
figure weights. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
The
escaped my head.
scale. It's a scale for people who are watching. It's a
So
scale that you're if
one
this, then this. It's logic. It's
so,
visual logic.
so visual mathematics is the figure weights, and the auditory problem
Is
solving mathematics
arithmetic.
is the
Yeah.
arithmetic. And those 2 together indicate mathematical talent.
Right. Right.
So the extended norms is something that our center fought for on the WISC 4 and got into both the WISC 4 and the WISC 5. And I was just told a couple weeks ago will be available for the WISC 6 as well.
That's good.
And they extend the scores past 19. And we've had kids that had 11 correct answers,
Beyond the ceiling.
the ceiling of 19. And now they get credit for those extra ones if the psychologist knows to check the
To use the
extended
norm.
norm
Right.
for any score that's 19 and above.
Right.
These expanded scores, extended scores are things psychologists don't know much about unless they happen to work with the gifted.
Right. And by the way, and they're not things that are totally off base. Pearson has approved these, Wexler has approved these. This is stuff that people need to know about. But again, we're not doing it. And what I see is that these things also need to be done with a lot of our individuals on the autism spectrum, because
Yes.
what's happening, we might go through and have, I mean, a normal kid might have, this might be their score profile. A gifted kid, this might be their score profile. Twice exceptional kid, this might be, but an autistic kid, they might be all over the place. And if we don't do all of those subtests, we might be missing that really big area of strength that doesn't show up in one of the others because something happened to prevent that kid from being able to demonstrate knowledge in that area. So I think, this is where doing kind of the standard plus the supplemental test is really a good recommendation when we're testing these kids, because we can see a broader picture of what's going on.
We've seen by using extended norms, we've seen 4, 5, 6, even 7 standard deviations of discrepancy between the child's strengths and the child's weaknesses.
Right. And that's not actually that uncommon, actually. I see that more often, especially in autism. I see, in fact, when I've got the profile looking like this and I don't know anything yet about the kid, I kind of start asking the autism question. So, yeah. All
Now,
right. So,
can they see your hands going like this on a podcast?
no, we're on video. We have video. Yeah, we're on video. So, Linda, tell me, how do you differentiate between a really gifted, asynchronous, twice exceptional kid who might be pretty visual, who might be pretty introverted, maybe has a hard time communicating their thoughts, and a kid with autism, because they are not the same?
I look at their social relations. I look at how whether they actually understand what's
Mhm.
expected socially.
Right.
That's a big thing. Another thing I look at is rigidity.
Hmm.
If they're very rigid, they can only see one way of doing something and they can't move off of that. Or if they get stuck and
Hmm.
they just can't, they don't have the
Switch.
mental flexibility to be able to do cognitive switching.
Hmm.
That those are some of the clues that I'm
Hmm.
looking for.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that we're we're able to see autism in boys easier than we can in girls.
Girls mask way better. Yeah.
Girls, we're finding later in life,
Hmm.
and it's frustrating. Parents will come to us with daughters that they suspect are on the spectrum, and yet we get hints of it, but
Hmm.
it's never full blown enough according to the diagnostic
Right.
criteria that are out there. They're based on boys.
Right.
And you just don't get to see those same things in girls. I see girls who work very hard to socially relate,
And are
and
pretty good at it, by the way.
they are on the spectrum, but
Yeah.
they because they're working so hard, because it isn't easy for them.
Hmm.
Um, that's a clue.
Right.
They shouldn't have to work that hard to
Hmm.
figure
Exactly.
out how to have a social life.
Yeah. I would add a few things that I see. Definitely, and I call it the neuro crash. It's very different than having a tantrum or having a meltdown. It's actually they like being so mentally exhausted that I can't think straight. And I might even have some behaviors associated with that, and some shutdown, some extreme rigidity, but even, hitting my head or having to kind of try and pull myself together. And that happens across males and females. I also see we have a pretty good pragmatic language test that I like, and it actually has them watch these videos and cue between like what should have happened here and what should have happened here. So it's both sides. It's both the kid who might be kind of treating this autistic kid kind of inappropriately, but also what the autistic kid might be doing that makes them stand out and look a little off in terms of drawing that attention. So that piece is there. The other thing I see classically is that kids with autism, even the girls, struggle with in one or more areas of adaptive functioning. So in other words, they have a hard time knowing even really basic things about how to entertain themselves when left to their own downtime. They don't have good ability for grooming, self grooming stuff. So, in other words, a perfect example: I have a young woman who went off to University of Utah, did a whole freshman year, took 17 credits each semester, had a perfect GPA. Mom went to pick her up and she hadn't really used her body wash like a single time in her shower for a year. So things like that can kind of get dropped off. And it's again, it's not that this kid didn't know how to take a shower, but the energy required to function in being able to hold together the skills for academics left nothing over for this kid to actually get in and use body wash and take a full body shower. So,
Well, I have seen hygiene issues with
mhm,
individuals on the spectrum.
mhm.
With
And it's not 100%, but that's one of the flags. Yeah.
yeah, with the gifted kids that I've worked with, usually mom is the intermediary who is
Mhm,
constantly reminding them that they have to brush their teeth every day, they have to shower every day, they have to use deodorant. They
mhm.
put up signs and on the mirror, did you do this? Do
Right,
this,
right,
do this. And we see this even in teens
right.
where they don't necessarily recognize that they have body odor. They
Mhm.
don't recognize that this is something that would be repugnant to
Mm.
themselves. Ooh, I don't smell good. They
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
they don't pay attention to that.
Right, right. And so you're saying that you see that even in the non-autistic
No,
population
no,
to some extent,
no.
only in autism.
Only in the
That's what
autistic.
I would say. I see it only in autism. My
Hygiene is
gifted,
for
yeah,
me, if I see a hygiene issue, I'm now now that's not the same as a child who gets very upset when mom brushes my hair.
right. Or
That
a kid who's really depressed, has anxiety, hasn't left their house, is
I'm
not
not talking
showering.
the sensory issues of grooming. I'm not talking about that. I'm
Yeah,
talking about hygiene, where
yeah.
kids just never develop a routine of brushing their teeth or brushing their hair or washing or taking a full body shower. They don't, it's not a value to them.
Mhm.
It
Well,
seems,
and
I
interestingly,
mean, I
and I'll
only
tell you,
see it in autistic kids.
yeah, on the backside of this story that I was sharing, when I really pinned down and tried to, figure out what was going on with this young woman's showering routines, it was that I really don't know. I don't have a system. So you and I have a habituated way of taking a shower that we don't think about it. We get in, we do it, we come out clean. And I think it's harder for kids on the spectrum to develop those habituated responses in relationship to multi-step tasks. In other words, it's harder for them to keep track of the steps, and they have to continually think about the steps because it doesn't generalize. Another thing we see is a kid can do their laundry at home, but they can't do their laundry in a college dorm because the washing machine looks different.
Right.
That's not true in gifted or twice exceptionality. And I think
That's
that's why the adaptive functioning skills play out. It has to do with the inability to generalize from this shower, this situation, this body wash, this pump on the wall to this new place where I have to bend over. It's a whole new sequence of steps, whereas you and I wouldn't have to take much effort to generalize the steps from this task of adaptive functioning to this task of adaptive functioning, I think kids with autism have to learn a whole new sequence.
And I think for me anyway, I'm just thinking off the top of my head now that um my cleanliness is an intrinsic value.
Hmm.
I need to feel clean.
Hmm.
And that I found with the people on the spectrum that I've known don't seem to have the same need.
Right. Right. Yeah. So let's talk about how. Well, two questions. The first one is: are you seeing, like, is this a really small percentage of autistic kids that you think are gifted, or do you think it's larger numbers than what we expect?
Well, when I started Gifted Development Center, it's we're coming on 44 years now. Um, I don't recall coming across any kids in the first 15 years that I would have thought were autistic. And now every single child who comes through our doors
Is asking that question.
is we have a checklist for recognizing twice exceptional children. And all of our families get that checklist. And the characteristics or the traits of autism are one of the sections. I don't recall in the last year coming across a single family that endorsed zero. Maybe a handful of families that I've worked with endorse zero on the autism spectrum. And some of them are endorsing 8 out of 12 of the
Mhm,
characteristics.
mhm. Well, and I've always believed, and I've worked autism for 30 years, I've always believed that we're missing intelligence in autism, that there's way more of these kids that have familial and intellectual ability, that have genetic lines for intellectual ability, that have kind of latent cognitive potential, even though we can't tap it, even though we can't touch it, even though we can't measure it, it's still there. These kids feel very differently to me than some of these kids who really do have what I would call the classical intellectual disabilities. They feel different, they look different, they process differently. And so it's interesting to me because I'm seeing a higher and higher correlation between giftedness and autism. And it sounds like you're seeing that as well.
Oh, absolutely.
What do you have any thoughts about that? I know that's totally off the script, but
Um, I think they're needed. I think we're seeing a tremendous increase in neurodiversity
mhm.
because in order for our population, our
Oh, you're
species to
it's almost
survive,
evolutionary, like an evolutionary trend that
it
you're
is
seeing.
evolutionary. I think that we need the skill set that an individual on the spectrum brings to bear, uh, especially in their adult life, on um, complex problems that other people can't solve.
Yeah, yeah, and it's really interesting because I have, I've heard other people say that, and certainly one of the things that I think you would agree that we saw is that autism, when it occurred, had almost everybody had really, really severe impairment. There wasn't this high functioning side. Whereas we started seeing gradually, and by the way, the numbers have exploded from, 1 in 10,000 to one in, I think the latest is 1 in 37. But in those numbers, what we're seeing is the exploding version of that is in this higher end of the spectrum. Whereas the low kids, the kids who really do have these really, really very severe impairments, those numbers are not changing as greatly as this really high end. So we would ask the question, are we just noticing them? Were they always out there? Or do you think they're really increasing?
No, they're really increasing.
And I
There's
think
no
I would
question
agree
about
with you.
it. And I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is assortative mating. Because if you stop and think about it, very low functioning individuals on the spectrum are not going to reproduce.
Right. Right.
Whereas very high functioning people are going to be working for NASA, as Temple Grandin says.
Right.
They're going to find each other. They're going to find each other online, and they're going to marry, and they're going to have children. And there's a greater chance that individuals on the spectrum are going to have children who are on the spectrum.
Right. Right. Well, we've covered some really great topics, Linda. Believe it or not, we're kind of winding up on our time here. So maybe for our last little segment here, maybe you could think about if we were to take maybe two or three things that you think are the most important things that came out of this session in terms of kind of those takeaways, those three kind of magic bullets. If you were to take away these three things, these are the three that I would like you to take away.
Well, there's one that we didn't discuss directly, but it was just implied. And that is, there's been a rumor that has annoyed you no end that you can either be gifted or you can be autistic, but you can't be both. And that is clearly a rumor. And the
And
best,
false. And false.
well, totally false. And the refutation of it, the best refutation of it, is in a new book that's coming out in June by Deirdre Levesque called Different Minds Gifted Children with ADHD, ASD, or other dual exceptionalities.
Mhm.
And she really addresses uh, this whole question very well. She also addresses uh, an opposite question, which is that individuals who are gifted can be misdiagnosed as autistic.
Right.
And that she's done a thorough job of debunking completely. And another one that's along the same lines is individuals who are gifted can be misdiagnosed as ADHD. And there's solid research that says, no, that's not true.
Right. Right.
So, one takeaway would be let's get rid of the myths and let's deal with the fact that, yes, there is an increase in the number of kids that are on the spectrum. You definitely can be gifted and you can be on the spectrum. And there are a lot of high functioning autistic individuals who make gigantic contributions. I love Temple Grandin's new book, Visual Thinking, because she mentions the autistic traits of everybody who's created our modern technological society. The
Right.
people we revere are they are loaded with autistic traits.
Right.
So we can't just ignore the importance of this population to our society, to the evolution of our society.
Right.
And I would like to recommend Marlo's book. I love that book. I
Thank
just adored it. And I love Temple Grandin's new book, Visual Thinking. I think that she does a wonderful job of
you.
describing how important this segment of the population is and how to educate them and parent them. So
Right.
there are resources out there that there weren't before. Are we noticing it more now? I don't believe that that's the case. I think we are getting more and more and more twice exceptional, multi exceptional, gifted, high functioning autistic individuals out there because the particular wiring that they have is absolutely essential for the survival of our species.
I think that's a brilliant, brilliant kind of end note. I would add that I think there's two pieces I think are really important. One, I think if we really want to understand autism, and this was why you liked my book, and it's why so many people like my book, we have to ask people who have autism. We've always, for many, many years, up until, in fact, when we did the search on, when I did lit review for my book, there was only 800 total studies that had included people with autism in the research, which is insane. We're talking about a completely different way of hardwiring neurologically an individual's brain, and that thinking system is just different. It's a very different way of thinking, processing, and reasoning and taking in the world. and to not include individuals with autism in discussions about what autism is, how we should be assessing autism, how we should be understanding autism is pretty asinine. Um, then I think the other thing that I would add, and I would close with this, is this idea that if you have a low functioning kid, a level 3 autism, a kid who seems like they have no way to speak or no way to control their body or no way to process. I think Dr. Ron Brewer does a nice job of telling us that we must presume competence, even if we don't see it. We must assume there's intelligence in there, and we must work towards finding ways to get that intelligence out and letting these individuals explore and move through these various areas. We have really great session on our website or on our library that's it's Fierce Love, and it was a guy who interviewed these parents of these really severely affected kids who never did talk. They maybe needed help self-toileting. They needed help maybe even feeding themselves, but they were artists, they were musicians, they were, did other things that were at this very, very high level that we would assume came from a gifted person. And so, really understanding that our definitions about intelligence really probably still have some development as it relates to understanding autism, and that we really are looking at something that we don't completely understand. And so, really assuming competence, assuming intelligence. I think we can't go wrong if we assume intelligence. So, and that'd be true across the spectrum. So,
Thank you,
thank you,
Marlo.
Linda.
This was
It was a
great.
true pleasure.